Maybe a little different accent, different topic. My special area is human sustainability, which is how do you help people and organisations perform at high levels, but with very low levels of stress, burnout, or attrition. So I got interested in this topic in my 20s. I don't look like it, but my first career was a professional rugby player, and I played all around the world. I was playing in Japan one year, last game of the season, and while I was playing, my head was just throbbing, and I couldn't run. I left the field, I ended up in hospital. They saw I was losing blood slowly. They did an operation and discovered I had 3 big cancerous tumours in my abdomen. They did a 5-hour operation, they took them out, but they had to take out my stomach, my spleen, part of my pancreas, so I lost a lot of weight. It took me about 3 months to recover, and I said to myself, just try and put everything back the way it used to be. So I went back to Japan, started playing, but a year later, the cancer came back and it had spread to my liver. And they did a temporary treatment, which worked for a while, but they said to me, what you need to do is every 3 months have an x-ray. Your oncologist will tell you if it comes back or not. So I would spend the whole 3 months just thinking, what if it comes back? What if it comes back? I was 27 years old, and I just kept churning. And I thought, what if I don't live till I'm 30? Why did this happen to me so young? And over and over and over. And I got incredibly stressed out by the situation. And then one day, I was at a low point. I picked up a newspaper article by a British academic called Dr. Derek Roger, who for 30 years at the University of York had been studying with his team, why do people respond so differently to stress? I met him, he'd come out to New Zealand, and for an hour and a half he told me everything him and his team had learned, but better than that, he told me what to do about my situation. So I did what he told me, and my stress level started coming down and down and down. It went from 10 out of 10 on the measure down to 0, which is where it is now. What was eventful for me, though, is the cancer came back 5 years later. And though the event was exactly the same as previously, that third time I didn't have all the stress with it. Same event, but very different response. So since that time, I've been traveling around the world, sharing this with people from all sorts of organisations. I work with NASA, the White House, Google, Walmart, many others. And they've noticed the same thing, that a lot of the pressures in your life you can't actually change that much, but your stress level is actually very flexible. So let me give you a few ideas. So the first thing to think about for you, you're working in high pressure environments, what causes your stress? If you're like most people, you're going to say it's the events happening in my life. And this is the traditional way we looked at stress. They have certain amounts of stress associated with them. So if you look at son, daughter leaving home, 29 points. How many people would that be stressful for if your son or daughter left home? All right, a few. How many would it not be stressful for? Right? So, exactly. Really. So all of these events, they found that people would respond. 5 people would go through them, and people would respond very differently to them, and they wanted to know why. So there are a few big ideas which emerged from this research, and this was the first one. Usually we look at stress and pressure as if they're the same thing, but they're not quite. You pull them apart, you start to get some options. So pressure, they came to define in this work, is external demand in your environment. Do you think everyone in this room has pressure on them? Yes. From what I've heard today, yes. Deadlines, demands, family pressure, finance. Second question, do you think everyone in the room is stressed? So we see some yes, some no, some maybe, it depends. You can see these two are slightly different. And in fact, what we notice when we go into organisations, and I'm sure you see this in yours, you'll have people under very high levels of pressure, but very low levels of stress. Whoever seen that in your career? High pressure, low stress, or have you seen the reverse? Someone in your life who has very low levels of pressure, but what are their stress levels like? Super high. How do they do that? So the researchers, the second big idea, they saw that to convert the pressure into stress, you need to do something quite specific. People who weren't doing this weren't getting stressed. To convert the pressure into stress, what you need to do is ruminate about the events which are happening in your life right now. So rumination is thinking over and over events from the past. Why did I do that? Why did I make that mistake? Or events from the future. What if this happens? What if this decision is made? What if this change is made? Attaching negative emotion and churning over and over and over. So think about times in your life when you've been stressed. You'll notice how much you're doing this. Or think about areas in your life right now where you are stressed, and you'll probably notice how much you're doing this. So you might think, yes, I do this. I was doing it at 3 a.m. last night when I woke up. I do it on my commute, so what? Matters for 3 reasons. The first one's your health. When you ruminate, your body goes into a state fight or flight to respond as if it's under a physical threat, which is not. And in short doses, that's fine, but for chronic ruminators, like many of us, you keep that up and the pressure stays on your system, you get exhausted, but it also wears out your coronary artery. Chronic ruminators have increased incidence of heart attacks, for one. It also makes you much less productive. You stop getting things done when you are lost in these ruminations. And third, it makes people exhausted and miserable. So we'd say there's nothing useful about this rumination. So the question which most organisations and people want to know at this point is, what do you do about it? So the first thing which really helps, and you can all take this if you'd like to later, is based on 30 years of research, we use psychometric scales to drastically increase people's awareness of how are they responding to pressures and challenges in their work and life. On a scale of 0 to 10, the first thing you will learn is how much you are ruminating. And so we'll have groups of people like this, all at the same company, often the same jobs, and some of the people in the room will get 10 out of 10 on rumination. They're ruminating a lot, and there'll be people at the same table with 0. And they get very curious about why is there such variation. Emotional inhibition, you'll learn how much do you bottle up your emotions. People who score very high in this one, they ruminate a lot and then it stays prolonged, whereas people who score low express what's going on for them. So this is something you can learn in about 90 minutes. You take the assessments, 10 minutes, you learn all about this, and then you learn how to bring your score levels down. And we do this sort of at scale in Adeption for, we're doing a bank at the moment, it's the whole organisation is doing this. So it's very simple, very quick, and everyone gets the same language and common metrics to discuss. So this is one thing I've been working on at Adeption for the past 15, 20 years. What was interesting though during the pandemic, this is all mental stress, we started to notice something else was going on as well. It wasn't just mental stress during the pandemic, something else was shifting for people. And what we started to see was that people were under a lot of pressure to do 3 things at once. Yes, they were getting ruminating and mentally stressed, but they were under pressure to grow, learn a whole lot of new ways to operate, perform, deliver consistently at high levels. And so the way most people were trying to do that was they were basically sacrificing themselves. They were working later, working earlier, working in the evenings, and we saw around the world people starting to burn out at record rates. And there weren't very good solutions to this out there. So we formed a global research team to look at this particular challenge. How do you do all 3 of these, but do it sustainably? And so we had quite a diverse research team. We ended up interviewing people who had to perform at high levels under a lot of pressure. Professional athletes and coaches, Navy SEALs, CIA agents, lots and lots of business people, and we worked out some interesting things about what was going on. First, we started to see why people were burning out. So when we interviewed them, we heard, you might have seen some books or articles, burnout is caused by X, solution is Y. And we saw that wasn't the case. There were multiple factors. So when we interviewed individuals, the most common things we heard associated with their burnout were these things here. The biggest one was the beliefs which were driving them. They had an incredibly strong work ethic to deliver no matter what, not to let people down, to say yes, and often these were stories they picked up early in life. They'd been rewarded for these behaviours and beliefs from their organisations, so they kept doing them. Values misalignment was very high. When people burned out, often their personal values were misaligned with their work, and they were working really hard, and they started to get very resentful and burned out. It wasn't just individual factors, it was organisational factors. These were the most common things that we heard. And it was the interplay between the individual and organisational factors, which when 3 or 4 of these occurred at the same time, that's when people were most at risk. So, you might just think about your experience of work in the last 3 or 4 years. Or the people you see in your organisations, what has the experience been? Our big question is, how do you work at high levels sustainably and create the conditions in the organisation to help people do that? So we did quite a bit about burnout, and we created assessments where you could work out exactly how you're going on a number of different elements to do with your growth, performance mode, and burnout risk. But one interesting thing we also did, last year we did the assessment with over 1,000 people. And over the Christmas break, I was just noting that most people's burnout rates were pretty high, but there was about 3 to 5% of the population we assessed had extremely low burnout rates, even though they're in the same organisations as everyone else. So I wrote to them in January and asked them if I could interview them to see, what are you doing differently from everyone else? And they came back, and there were 8 patterns which we heard from these people, things they were doing differently. For instance, they handled their phone differently at home. They didn't use their phone at home. They didn't look at it. Most people are all over their phone in the evenings, and they can't switch off. They find it very hard to. The people who had very low burnout risk, they had a specific strategy of what they did with their phone. It was an interesting one. I'll tell you one example, probably the most interesting interview I did, and that'll be it. And that came from an executive at Amazon. I interviewed him, and he said that Amazon is a very intense culture. He said anyone who survives for 3 years is considered a veteran. I said, whoa, how long have you survived? And he said, a decade. I said, how did you last so long without burning out? And he said, well, I did burn out, but I made some changes. I said, okay, what did you do? He told me a few different things, but there was one that stood out to me. He said, the single biggest thing I did to make the change was dancing. And I said, what do you mean dancing was the biggest thing you did? And he said, Argentinian tango, to be precise. I said, what do you mean? And he said, what used to happen is I'd be at work all day, I'd be in my brain, problem solve. Then I'd go home in the evening. Now I'm with my wife, my kids, but I'm still in the same mental mode as work. And I realised I couldn't switch off, and I burned out. So he said I had to look for something. Tried lots of different things, but when I discovered Argentinian tango, I realised that it's the direct opposite of my work world. He said, in Argentinian tango, you must be in your heart and you must be in your body. 2 places I never am during my workday. And he said, second, the currency is the opposite. He said, in Argentinian tango, no one cares how much money you make. They don't care who you work for. They don't care your title. They don't even care if you got a job. There's only one currency. Can you dance? So he says, I go along in the evening, finish my work, go along, I'm dancing, I'm moving, I'm sweating, I'm in my heart, I'm communicating to my partner through my body, and my work world for the only time disappears. And I completely recharge. I go home, I feel exhilarated, and I go to work the next day and I feel recharged. And he said, it's like it's my opposite world. I was like, that's an interesting phrase, opposite world. And we kept interviewing people, and we heard this pattern over and over with these high performers with low burnout risk. They had an opposite world, which was some activity which was the direct opposite of their work world. That was one of the patterns. So just ask you in the room, how many people feel like they've got an opposite world which they do on a regular basis? Interesting, all right? And probably quite a few of you think, I used to, but I've stopped doing it because work, kids, dependents, we get busy. So I'd encourage you to look for this. Based on the pattern we heard, this is a very strong buffer. If you would, I'll just show, if you're not sure, this is the pattern, these are where the opposite worlds most commonly come from. These 6 categories. They're very different from work mode usually. And more specifically, this is what we heard. Opposite worlds were one pattern we heard. There were 7 others. Okay, so it looks like that's my time. One thing to note, the first thing I talked about with the stress, that comes from the Art of Resilience. The second part is Grow, Perform, Sustain. It's another assessment. 2 complementary assessments to do with human sustainability in organisations. We do these at scale. Adaption focuses on technology and development at scale. And Jamie is sitting at the back of the room. If anyone would like to try these out, you can email Jamie. He may even give you a bigger discount, 50 or 100%. He's a very generous man. So feel free to email Jamie at the back of the room. I think that's my time. So I'll just see, is there any time for questions? And if so, I'm happy to answer some how-tos if you want.
Okay.
Yes, Bill.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, it's quite apt from your background. The All Blacks,
Yeah.
I read a report that talked about blue heads and red heads, risk and stress levels. Is that related to some of this as well?
Yeah, very much like the rumination. Sort of that is to do with, are you in a threat state, which is like the red hat state, where you are stressed out, you're worried, I've got to give a presentation, I don't know if I can do it. Whereas they try and get the athletes into a challenge state. And one of the ways to make the fastest switch is if you feel yourself feeling anxious, I'm really worried about this meeting, this thing I've got to do, researchers found if you simply relabel it as excitement, you'll still feel anxiety, but you'll also feel anticipation, energy, and excitement. And there's a biological switch which happens which puts you into a challenge state. Athletes do this all the time. If you see them interviewed, how are you feeling about the big game? They'll never say, we're anxious, we're really worried. They'll always say, we're excited. They're trying to get into a challenge state. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.